So good morning and welcome everyone. I hope you are all here to learn about and share on the topic of secrets to success, effective alternatives to out-of-school suspension. We have a lot of information to share with you today, so we're going to jump right in. My name is Bettina Toner. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Krokidas and Bluestein. We're a boutique law firm here in Boston. KIPP provides legal services to nonprofit, for-profit, and public clients in a variety of practice areas, including education. KIPP's education practice group has a diverse client base that includes Massachusetts charter schools and other educational entities, and we provide a full array of legal services to our charter school clients, including compliance, governance, transactional, and other relevant legal matters such as special education and student discipline. So a little about me before I hand things off to my colleague Eric Jordan and Nikki Barnes, the Executive Director of KIPP Massachusetts. At KMB, I practice in the education and employment practice groups, where I represent charter schools and other schools in a wide array of organizational policy and student service matters, as well as employment matters. And I also represent charter schools and other schools in litigation matters related to a whole variety of practice areas. So with me today, as I said, is my KMB colleague, Eric Jordan, and Nikki Barnes, the Executive Director of KIPP Massachusetts, and I will hand it off to Nikki and Eric to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everybody. I'm the practitioner in the space. And she's already told you I'm the Executive Director of KIPP Massachusetts, but what I'd like this audience to know is I spent 18 years as a classroom teacher, most of them in the most powerful and beautiful years, middle school. Yeah. I was the teacher with very strong culture in my classroom. I also became a dean of culture. I was an AP and also a principal. I also want you to know, when I was the principal, we had suspension numbers that were as high as 15%. Now, as the executive director, we are below 3%. And you should also know I don't play. So I want you to know, alternatives to suspension does not mean no consequences. It means there are things that you can put in place to reduce suspension. And so I just want you to know that when you think about questions or when I share a couple of case studies. Eric.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Eric Jordan. I work with Bettina at Krokidas and Bluestein, where I assist charter schools and the full range of their legal needs, from student discipline to regulatory compliance to civil rights matters. Prior to working at Krokidas and Bluestein, I did civil rights investigations for a university, and I am also formerly a middle school teacher. So with that, we will go ahead and get started with some of our substance.
So before we continue, I just want to remind everyone, always has to be a legal disclaimer, right? So just a reminder that the material we're sharing today is for informational purposes and not intended to be legal advice. Charter schools should always consult with local counsel with respect to legal matters that have legal consequences, such as student discipline. Now I'm going to hand it over to Eric, who's going to frame this issue for us with some compelling data that will reinforce why avoiding school suspension is so important.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we'd like to begin today's discussion with an overview of the use of out-of-school suspensions across the U.S. for the last few decades. So if we move on to the next slide, in 2022, the Learning Policy Institute published national data that they aggregated from the Department of Education and the Civil Rights Data Collection. Between 1973 and 2018, there's been a gradual increase in the use of out-of-school suspensions, with a peak in the early 2010s. So specifically, the national average for overall suspension rate climbed from approximately 4% in 1973 to 7% for the 2009 to 2010 school year, and then declined to 5% for the 2017 to 2018 school year. Now, the climb in suspension rates until the early 2010s was largely due to the implementation of zero tolerance policies across the country. Those zero tolerance policies encouraged disciplinary action for all sorts of infractions of a rule, even for relatively minor, non-violent offenses such as tardiness or, quote, disrespect. In January 2014, however, the Department of Education issued guidance indicating that exclusionary discipline practices such as out-of-school suspensions and expulsions were not actually the answer to creating a safe and productive school environment, and they instead encouraged state, district, and school leaders to rethink their student discipline policies and to rely on suspension and expulsion only as a last result and for appropriately serious infractions. So in support of its 2014 call to reduce out-of-school suspensions and expulsions, the Department of Education cited that those exclusionary practices disproportionately affected certain student groups, including students with disabilities, LGBTQIA students, and many students of color. And so as you'll note from this graphic, Black students have consistently experienced out-of-school suspensions at the highest rate among racial and ethnic groups since at least 1973. If we go to the next slide, please. This data demonstrates that students with disabilities are often suspended at higher rates than students without disabilities, even within racial and ethnic classifications. All right, if we move on to the next one, please. So this graphic reflects some data from the 2020 to 2021 Civil Rights Data Collection, and it was published last fall. So in the 2020 to 2021 school year, there were approximately 48 million public school students enrolled in kindergarten to the 12th grade. As demonstrated here, a number of student groups were overrepresented in suspensions and expulsions. For example, Black male students represented 8% of total K-12 enrollment, but 18% of those who received one or more out-of-school suspensions and 18% of those who were expelled. Black male students were nearly 2 times more likely than white male students to receive an out-of-school suspension or expulsion. And similarly, Black female students were also nearly 2 times as likely as white female students to receive suspensions and expulsions. In addition, the data indicated that the public school students who received one or more out-of-school suspensions missed a total of more than 2 million school days for that academic year. If we move along, please. This graphic also comes from that 2020 to 2021 Civil Rights Data Collection. Of total K-12 enrollment, 14% of students were served under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and 3% of students were served under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And both groups of those students with disabilities were overrepresented among students who were suspended or expelled. And moving along, please. Let's actually have you go back just one. Okay. Okay, this is fine. Thank you. Yeah, actually, Bettina, could you go one more?
One more back.
One more forward. Okay, thanks. I feel like oh, there you go. So while exclusionary discipline practices like out-of-school suspensions and expulsions have been advocated by some as an effective means to obtain better behavior from the excluded student or maintain school norms by removing a disruptive student, many studies have indicated that those practices have not been as beneficial as one would hope, that the benefits of student exclusion are few and the consequences many in both the short and long term. So for example, both national and statewide research has demonstrated that students who have received an out-of-school suspension experience a higher number of behavioral incidents and days of subsequent school years lost, a higher number of absences over time, lower academic credit accumulation, lower graduation rates, lower college enrollment rates, and unfortunately, higher involvement in both juvenile and adult criminal justice systems. Now, research shows that exclusionary discipline is largely ineffective at improving school safety and deterring infractions, and it indicates that out-of-school suspensions may have long-lasting negative impacts on those suspended students. Interestingly, however, studies have also found that non-suspended students in schools with high suspension rates have lower test scores than students at schools with overall lower suspension rates, which means that there's negative impacts for all students when exclusionary discipline practices are overused. Okay, so now we'll go to the next slide, please. So in the early 2010s, there was a move to reduce exclusionary discipline practices like out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. And many states have made progress towards that goal, as demonstrated by the graphic here, comparing state out-of-school suspension rates between the 2011-2012 school year to the 2017-2018 school year. However, there is still more work to be done. So states have employed a variety of methods to reduce out-of-school suspensions, including requiring or encouraging the use of suspension alternatives. So this table of the 50 states and Washington, D.C. indicate that as of May 2021, 19 states plus Washington, D.C. require an alternative consequence to be used or considered instead of or in addition to an out-of-school suspension or expulsion. And in 18 states, those alternatives may be used or considered instead of an out-of-school suspension or expulsion. Moving to the next slide, please. There are a number of alternatives to suspension that may be employed by school leaders to meet their goals of reducing misbehavior and increasing student learning. For example, community service, peer mediation and mentoring, parent conferences and parent supervision, and restricting a student's access to extracurricular activities and other school-sponsored events. Now, different alternatives may work differently for varying age groups, and best practices change over time, so it's always important to look at the variety of options that may work best for you. And so this has been a national overview of out-of-school suspensions. I'm now going to transition to Nikki Barnes, who'll be able to discuss what it might look like in practice to employ some of these alternatives.
Thank you, Eric. I'll also give you a little more data on like what do my schools look like. I'm responsible for 2,200 students in the state of Massachusetts. I have a K-8 in Boston in the neighborhood of Mattapan, and that's about 588, and then a K-12 in the city of Lynn, that's about 1,600 students. Most of my students are Black and brown. 15% of our students have disabilities. Between the campuses, about 10 to 15% are multi-language learners. One thing I'll note too, though, is 87% of our leaders look like our students, and 60% of our teachers look like our students. So 87% of our leaders identify as people of color, and over 60% of our teachers identify as people of color. Because one thing I want to talk about is who you hire will impact what you're able to do in your school to reduce suspensions. So let's go to a couple of mindsets that are really first. You can go to the next. So you have to have in your school, this is what worked for ours, all of the children are all of ours, as Baldwin. That even though you're a kindergarten teacher in a building that's K-8, the system, the cultural system that we all agree on, all of the children are all of ours. So even if you're a kindergarten teacher and you see an 8th grader doing something, you will know that what that 8th grader is doing either is in line with our culture or not, and what you should and should not do with that 8th grader that you may not know, okay? School-wide systems set up kids, 90% of the kids, if you have strong school-wide systems, 90% of the kids are gonna be okay. I'll give you one example. We looked at data and we saw that a lot of our students were escalating or getting in trouble at the beginning of the school day. They just came in mad. I think that's what they do in New England anyway. People are mad in the morning. But they came in mad, they came in frustrated, and that would, by the time, if it's 7:15, you're walking in, by 9 o'clock, you're in the dean's office, now you've escalated, now we gotta do something. So what we decided to do was, let's make arrival joyful. Let's turn that into a fun time, and everybody has a role at arrival, every adult. Our counselors are checking on their kids. The deans, the APs are in a certain place. Everybody has a role, and we decided that everybody comes in. When you come into our schools in the morning, we play music. So that just set the kids up for joyful, even though they might come in and say, that song again, Miss Barnes? Yes, that song again. I'm playing some Earth, Wind, and Fire for you because you don't know what Earth, Wind, and Fire is. But what happened was our problems at the beginning of the school day began to decrease. So I will say that that system helped. So you don't have to play music, but the arrival should be joyful. Suspension is the last move, but we will suspend. So we're not a school that will never. It's just, we all agreed it's the last move. And there's a document we have what we call guardrails, and on that first spreadsheet of that document, it says, remember, suspension is the last move in all red, because you might need to see that when you're the one who the kid just cursed at, right? You need to remember that. One thing that helped us is the first opportunity that an incident happens, we say we're going to use this as an opportunity to learn. That's a mindset that we have. And we have to remind ourselves, because sometimes the first time you do something, I still want to get you out of here. But we all agree that's an opportunity to learn. Logical consequences are really powerful, immediate, and proximate. Like, you did this during lunch, you're going to feel it during lunch. That logical consequence, especially for younger students who might not get it 2 days later. What did I do? Okay? And restoring and mediating does not mean you don't get consequences. Because I've heard people say, I'm tired of this restorative justice. There's a justice side to it, people. We can restore you and you still are going to have some consequences. Right? And we still give kids voice. So I have 3 case studies, and these are real case studies. Names have been changed. And these are all situations where we could have suspended. We could have suspended in these situations. For each case study, I'm going to have 4 steps, and the steps are always going to be first around winning the room or that space. So I'm getting deep down, y'all, to the dean level, the teacher level. That's the only way I can talk. And if I really need the principals here, but they're on vacation. The step 2 is going to be always around figure out why. That gives you some time to calm down because you just were offended, or the teacher was offended, or even a student was hurt. The step 3 is always going to be about logical consequences. Step 4, now what's the proactive move we're going to make next to hopefully ensure this doesn't happen again? So imagine, and you can raise your hand if you've had this one happen, Jay, 4th grader, severely disrupted the classroom, damaged the property, yelled and swore at the teacher. Has anybody experienced that with a 4th grader? I know, 4th grade, no, 4th grade for real. So in all of our elementary classrooms, we do have a small, just cool down corner. I mean, just throw some pillows there, a couple of books, some signs, go to the side of the room. So there's a cool down corner or the call for help. So every teacher does know how to call for help. If you have an experienced teacher, that experienced teacher might be able to say, I see you are struggling today. I want you to head to the cool down corner. That experienced teacher might be able to command that space, whereas a newer teacher might need to practice. This just happened in my classroom, call for help, keep teaching. And make sure the student's disruption stops or is removed. Again, think about your teachers. One teacher, I could get that student to go to the side. We're going to help you out, but we're going to keep learning. Another teacher might need somebody to come in quickly. So ensuring that you win the space in that moment takes the power out of that situation, which is really what ends up hurting us as teachers. The teacher is like, that kid cursed at me. There's no way that kid is not going to be suspended. And we have to make sure that they don't feel like we don't care about them. Then, of course, you take the time to figure out what happened. This is when you engage the caregiver, not when you're about to call and say, we're going to have a hearing. Because we have to have a hearing before you can suspend in Massachusetts. But you begin to engage the caregiver just around, hey, this happened. Anything happened this morning? And then your logical consequences. In this instance, the teacher was a strong teacher. We did not suspend, but during recess, after Jay calmed down, hey, oh, you're feeling better, Jay, good. Now get back in here and do the work you missed. You missed that work, so get back in here and do it. And then we figured out what are the moves we need to do just in case Jason does this again. Jay. The teacher had to practice some things. We worked with the student to figure out, once we figured out what it was, I'm sorry, I'm pausing because I just got a text that my aunt died. Give me 10 seconds. No, but think about this, you all. These are things that happen in school with our children. And I have the capacity, because I know what my auntie would say, keep going, boo. And let me turn off my watch, because everybody's going, oh, no, Aunt Geraldine. I'm good, I'm okay. But we wanted to always do the proactive moves to reduce the likelihood. But in this case, we did not suspend the student, and we can go back to it, we can ask some questions, because I know I got to keep going. Let's go to middle school, my favorite one. Jocelyn and Jordan, 8th graders, my favorite grade. How many of you have had this? There's a little cafeteria argument going on, leads to some pushing and shoving. So it wasn't an all-out brawl, but there was hands put on. And then when the adults got in to work it out, they got cursed out. Years ago, I would have been like, both of y'all going home. We didn't do it in this moment because we trained whoever was running the cafeteria to win the space. We have a table in our cafeteria that we can move you to. We call it practice lunch. We're gonna help you practice lunch until you learn how to do lunch right. We remove the students, and for this one, you see the term stop the world moment. We teach all of our teachers how to have a stop the world moment. So if you all were in the cafeteria, they were pushing and shoving, we're going to get them out, and then we're gonna say, everybody, we do this, get to 0, that's a 0-inch voice, that means silence. Scan, notice, address. That was a stop the world moment. We had a fight in our cafeteria. That's not who we are. We're gonna figure out what's wrong, what happened with Jocelyn and Jordan, but we want you to know that's not who we are. In that moment, if you can get someone to do that, you have now taken the power out of the fight, and you have restored and reclaimed the space, which allows you then to give Jocelyn and Jordan an opportunity for you to figure that out. Again, dig into why, logical consequences. For them, it might be, so for a couple of weeks, we gotta watch y'all at lunch till we figure it out. We gotta watch you at lunch, and then again, the proactive move. What led to this? Why did they argue? Why did they fight? What can we do to keep them from getting into this situation again? The last one is high school. Imagine Terry was an 11th grader, social media arguing, leading the students threatening to fight one another in school. And there was lots of buzz. Now, threat, not the threat like I'm bringing a gun to school, that's a different game. But the threat that the kids, somebody's always gonna tell. Terry, somebody's gonna fight, and we know, we can sense it. So what do? We win the space before they even walk in the building. Both of the students, come on with us. We're gonna figure this out. Now, what you see on the screen is a book bag check, locker check. I want a name that we talk to our students about getting their permission to check their book bag, or we have them empty their book bag, because my attorney would let me know that's crossing some lines there. But we can check out the locker, and then we engage caregivers. Again, dig into it, logical consequences. They could not participate in after-school events, and we made sure it was one they really wanted to go to. We said, we can't trust you all because of what you did online. Y'all need some space, we don't need you there. And you do not have a right to go to the basketball game. That's not your right. That's a privilege that you have because we can trust you in that space. In our high school, we have advisories. Advisories are really important. They start in 9th grade, they go up to 12th grade. They stay with their advisory through 12th grade, and if we do it right, they stay with their advisor through 12th grade, and in fact, when they graduate from high school, we call them by advisory. That's how important the advisor is at our high school, and so that's when we addressed and we figured out what the problem was, and we helped them to set ground rules for each other. So 5 years ago, for all 3 of these situations, we could have easily suspended. We did not. Ask me more questions, I'll get my brain together, but thank you.
Do folks have questions for Nikki before we delve into the exciting legal piece and sort of how to operationalize this at your school? You said you gave a question.
Yeah. Okay.
What about the ones where you call the caregiver the parent and they curse you out and they don't want to engage?
Mm-hmm.
And those are the parents who the kids turn up late. Those are the parents where the kids don't do their homework. Those are the parents that we tried with, so nothing is happening. Now we call the caregiver, we know that there's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
We
still don't suspend them. We call the caregiver to engage the caregiver, and we assume that every single caregiver wants the best for their child. But understood, Notice I said we assume. So that's our point of view. So yes, we have caregivers who we will call and they will curse us out. Miss Smith, we're not going to have this conversation if you're going to curse at me. I'm going to end this conversation right now. Peace. Now, what happened with Jay and this kid? That does not mean that we still need to suspend the student. In fact, it might mean we need to find out how to keep them in school because of that. So we still figure out a way to keep them in school unless they are a danger to someone, to themselves, to a teacher, or to another student. And the way we do that is we work together as a team. So nobody is alone in this work. So I can give you examples of when a student has been suspended. If a student has a pattern of repeated violations of our culture, and we've implemented several structures, several systems, a buddy system. We do have mental health counselors in our schools. Our deans, the teachers, the team of teachers has worked with them. Sometimes we will have to go, okay, now we have to suspend. But if the parent is not engaged, that does not mean suspension for us. That actually means what can we do in the school to support that student. In spite of the parent not being engaged, it also might mean just give it a little bit of time. Call them back in 48 hours. Or if the only time Ms. Smith is hearing from us is when their child is in trouble, why would I want to talk to you anyway? So we talk to our teachers about once a quarter, at least, no, we say 2 positive touch points with every family once a quarter. 2 positive touch points. And believe me, I've been cursed out. I have told parents, you're not talking to me like that. No. But that is disconnected from the child. That's disconnected from the student. We're going to do our best with the student. Yes, sometimes it does lead to suspension. But I'll also tell you this, you all. In my schools, we're not walking around having fights everywhere here and there. That doesn't happen in our school. Not because our children are that black and brown and poor and got drug, whatever. It's because we deal with the small things first. How you come into the building with joy. How did you speak to her? Wait a minute, are y'all disagreeing? Let's figure out how to deal with that. We love you, we care for you, and you shall learn in here. So I understand that, but yeah, we would try to rebuild the relationship with the parent all the way for years. For years, we would do it. It's just the work. Yes, I'm sorry. Am I the MC can do all that? Mm-hmm. So vaping at school is a big deal. First of all, we have the vape detectors. Okay. Vaping at school, I think we may or may not suspend for, but we could. Having a vape on campus, we'll investigate and we'll decide. We may or may not. If you've done it a couple of times, if you're selling it, if you are passing it out to other people, okay, now that's gonna raise it up. Now this is on campus, this is a blah, 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 what's that term? Controlled substance on campus. We have suspended for that. But you all, now what's next? Now what are we gonna do why you got a vape? What's in the vape? You know, we had a kid who vaped and went to the hospital for 6 months because they didn't know what was in it. So yes, we can suspend for that, but we try to get ahead of that as much as possible. Did I say anything wrong? No.
So in Massachusetts, we have our statutes are set up so that it makes a distinction between sort of more serious offenses, so drugs, weapons, and assault on staff are like big offenses that you can suspend for longer or you can expel. everything else is what I typically refer to as like code of conduct violations. And in Massachusetts, we'll talk about this in a few minutes, the statute or regulations actually require schools to consider alternatives to out-of-school suspension for those sort of lower level offenses. But for the big ones, drugs, weapons, assault on staff, you don't have to consider those. Although, best practice is always to consider them if they're appropriate, if it's a first-time offense. But there is a distinction, at least in our state, over, different types of offenses like that.
Oh, yes.
The question I have is when you went from that 15% suspension rate to the 3%, and you had teachers who had worked in your schools for a long time and were expecting, like, a student does this, they're suspended from my classroom, I'm not going to see them for a few days, you shifted. How did you go about making that shift to, honor your teachers?
Yes. Yeah, especially as a teacher who I was the tough teacher. Oh, the question was, that's right. How did you go when we went from 15% suspension down to 3%? How did that feel for experienced teachers who were accustomed to, if you did this, you're gone. If you did this, you're gone. How did they not feel like you're letting kids disrespect me in class and come back and things of that nature? So I'll try to name a couple of things. One, I'm a very input kind of person, and so even when I was the principal, I named, so guess what, you all? I didn't know it was bad to suspend 15% of kids. I didn't know that. I'm from the South. You do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it if you're a child, period. That's just not how the children do, though, these days, okay? That's where we are, you all, okay? So that was hard for me, and what I learned was, I asked myself, how can I create what I had in my own classroom? I did not need to write referrals. Why would the same kid come into my classroom and behave and misbehave in the hallway? I had to think about the relationships that I had with kids and the systems and structures that I had in place. So we want to reduce suspensions, and we agreed on, here are the things that you should text us on around, and where we would have a student be removed. So one thing we know is, if you curse at a teacher, we are going to take you out of that classroom. You are likely not coming back that day to that classroom. That doesn't mean we're going to suspend you. We agreed on that. But you might not come back to that classroom for that day. You're going to have to do some type of repair with the teacher, and you're going to have some consequences. And depending on the situation, we're going to reclaim that space in that room. So we agreed on that. We also have an opportunity for teachers to come and say, I disagree, I think Nikki should be suspended. We hear them out, we make a decision and hope we've built enough trust. And I will tell you this, when you have a school system where the structure, the culture itself lends itself to just joy and peace, those types of behaviors, even post-COVID, are less. And so we asked the teachers to join us in this, and we also committed to, here's what the principal is going to do. Here's what the dean is going to do. My principals, APs, deans, they are not in their offices. They are in the schools. So that helped us. But we do get mad along the way. We do disagree with each other. Yeah.
All right, so we'll leave some time at the end for questions. I did want to share with you some tips and tricks and some strategies for how to optimize your school's use of suspension alternatives. So there are a number of strategies that we at KMV advise our charter schools to consider that focus on two main areas, and Nikki has really touched and talked about the first one, which is school climate and culture. And then the second one is operations and how to operationalize some of these best practices at your school. So the first one, climate and culture, let's talk about that. So minimizing out-of-school suspensions begins with a school climate and culture, as Nikki's described, that gives staff the tools and supports to help them feel empowered to access and make the best use of alternative remedies. So what does that mean? It means that school leadership should ensure that charter school staff understand the roles and responsibilities related to student discipline, right? So just as a first step. So example of that would be, as Nikki described, so how to identify what the stop the world moments are, and when to use the cool down corner versus when to call for help. Just as a basic matter, staff need to know what to use and when. And sort of related to that are making sure that staff have targeted and timely professional development opportunities in areas including the school's discipline policies and their equitable application. So making sure that staff understand the student code of conduct, the Title IX policy, the non-discrimination policy, the bullying policy, what those policies provide and require, and also how to equitably apply them. You also want to make sure that your staff have adequate training on evidence-based behavior management techniques, so MTSS, positive behavioral interventions and supports, making sure that your staff know what are the alternative remedies. So what's in my toolbox of options to choose if I'm considering suspension or thinking that that's an appropriate response. And then making sure that staff are able to identify students who may have a heightened need for supports or referral to SPED or 504 supports. So again, not everybody's necessarily going to know when to make a referral, but staff should know, sort of under your school's child find responsibilities, like, maybe I should bump this up to somebody, and knowing who that somebody is if a child is struggling. So a few other things to think about in terms of climate and culture. Leadership should make sure that discipline policies are clear, flexible, and equitable, and allow the decision maker a range of options. So making sure that if your principal is the decision maker, they have a range of options to choose from. And making sure that, similarly for teachers, APs, et cetera, that they have an array of options before suspension, before you get to a hearing level, to address the situation. And again, knowing what that range of alternative remedies looks like. And then again, so as Nikki mentioned, which I always think is a great practice that KIPP has, morning routines, school routines, morning routines, back to school routines are thoughtfully designed and implemented. So the morning routine at KIPP is a great example. Thinking about routines for back to school. So we all know, the time right before school vacation or right after vacation, right before summer, always tends to be, a heightened time of discipline incident. So having routines that are thoughtfully designed around those periods of time and making sure that everyone's trained and on board with that, those approaches. And then the last one I wanted to mention for purposes of school climate and culture, if you have an SRO, a school resource officer on your campus, minimizing the role of the SRO in law enforcement in student discipline matters. Here in Massachusetts, many schools have gotten rid of SROs over the last decade or so, since 2014. I will say in recent years, that started to shift a little bit in the other direction, so some schools are bringing SROs back. I would advise, if you can, to minimize the role of the SRO and making sure that your own staff are adequately trained and have the tools that they need, so you don't need to call on the SRO or law enforcement. So I wanted to, this is a lot of legalese, our regulation here in Massachusetts. What I want to talk to you about, or why I have it up here, is I mentioned, well, that's unfortunate. There we go. So let's shift to the operations piece of discipline best practices, which is why I included Massachusetts statute here. As I mentioned earlier, in 2022, Massachusetts student discipline regulations were amended to require for those lower level school-based offenses that I mentioned a few moments ago. So not the big offenses, drugs, weapons, assault on staff, but the lower level school-based offenses. The regulations were amended to require that schools first consider ways to re-engage the student in learning. So the decision maker had to consider alternatives to out-of-school suspension. And not use a suspension from school as a consequence until alternate remedies were tried and documented. So you basically either need to determine that either need to try the alternative remedies and decide, if they work, and you're not going to go forward with the suspension, or the decision maker needs to make a determination, document a determination, why the alternatives tried didn't work, or why it would be futile, essentially, to try them. And it has to be documented. So this was a shift prior to that decision, decision makers, typically the principal in many schools, had discretion to consider alternate remedies. And the reality is some schools did this and did this well, and other schools just didn't do it. So the regulation was changed, and so now for these lower level offenses, a school decision maker needs to consider those alternative remedies before suspending a student out of school. So again, as I mentioned earlier, just quickly, it's not required, sort of consideration of alternate remedies is not required for those more serious offenses, but it still may be appropriate. And I always advise my schools, there could be a situation where a student brings a bong in a backpack to school. We've had this happen, but it's a first-time offense. It's an honor roll student. Something's going on in their life. It might be appropriate to suspend the student out of school. The more appropriate response might be to connect the student with mental health counseling or some other support. So it's always an alternative, and I advise my schools to get in the practice of considering those alternatives and have an array available. Again, you have to have the alternatives to be able to consider them, right? So, how can schools and leadership set staff up for success in this area? Here are some tools and strategies that we at KMB have worked with our charter school clients on to make it easier for them to comply with the law and school policies, and to make things flow more smoothly. Not just in the use of suspension alternatives, but in all aspects of student discipline. I'm a big fan of lists, checklists, form letters, and all of those things. I love to do them. I make them for my clients all the time, so it's a joy for me to create them. But I think that my role as an attorney is really to help our charter school clients succeed and not have to think about, in the moment, all of the steps that they need to follow. So I am a big fan of things like template notices and finding letters, and checklists. So we included just an example of one. This is a snippet of the checklist that we use for long-term suspensions. You'll see in the materials that have been uploaded, I think it's a 3 or 4 page document. It's a lot of steps. And so if you are in the moment as a decision maker, from start to finish, what elements do I need to include in a notice letter? What do I need to include in a findings letter? What are the things I need to say at a discipline hearing? I like to set all of this out in a checklist. We have one, this is the long-term suspension checklist in your materials. We have a short-term checklist. All of these things are things that can be helpful to your staff, and your legal counsel can help you prepare them. So some examples, so template letters, checklists. I also suggest for my school clients, we have an investigation form. It's like a 10-page form. Again, I get a little crazy with the forms, but it walks you through how to conduct a good investigation, whether you're doing a bullying investigation, a Title IX investigation, start to finish. And then the investigator, which in many schools is the assistant principal, it could be somebody else, can use that form to write a good investigation report. So all of these things kind of build on each other and can be helpful. Same thing for manifestation determination reviews. And then also making sure, again, alternative remedies by grade range. You could put that in a list. You could put it in a flow chart, making sure that staff have, all of this information at their fingertips. I'm also a big fan of quick reference guides, cheat sheets, flow charts. All of those things can be helpful. And then lastly, I did want to make sure to leave time for folks to ask questions. But thinking about we're coming back full circle to Eric's discussion about data. So most, if not all states, require charter schools and other public schools to collect and report to their state educational agency data on student discipline. But charter schools can and should use data collection themselves to refine their approaches to student discipline, and including ways to best use alternate remedies. So as I mentioned a moment ago, developing target forms to collect data can assist with compliance with relevant state laws, federal laws, and school policies. But schools also should think about ways to track and utilize that information internally. So consider tracking by types of discipline and when they're used, including data on in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, short and long-term suspensions. I also suggest tracking MDRs, including the outcomes of those manifestation determination reviews. Referrals to law enforcement can be a helpful data point. And then tracking offenses and alternate remedies that were tried and their effectiveness. And then lastly, appeals and their outcomes can be helpful to track as well. And you're going to want to think about using that data to consider the impact of suspensions on different student groups. So students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQIA students, English learners, students of low-income backgrounds, and then break out and review that data. You can do it by charter school if you're one school, or if you're a charter school network by network. It can be helpful to track suspension data by decision maker. That can be a very telling data point, and can be used as a way to provide professional development opportunities or training when needed. If you have a particular decision maker that's implementing a higher number of out-of-school suspensions or overusing out-of-school suspensions. And then coordinating regular review and analysis of data by and feedback from school administrators, school staff, school trustees, students, parents, and other stakeholders. And finally, you'll want to use that information to adjust, revise, and refine policies as needed. Your discipline policies and practices don't have to stay static, and I would suggest that it can be very helpful to use that information, track that information and use it, and then refine your policies as needed and use it for training and other purposes. So with that, I will open it up for other questions that folks have for any of the three of us. Yeah.
Over here. Yes.
Okay. So if you have a student who engages in some low-level activity that requires suspension, you choose to do an in-school suspension, how can you reset the classroom and that student, or prepare the classroom and the student to come back to class after?
If the students' actions were public, then the reclamation of the classroom is public. We match that. And so even if the student is sent to ISS, and we do ISS as well, OSS, ISS, emergency removals, we've done it all. I've had to restrain kids, everything. I was trained though. We would either have the teacher or the dean to acknowledge what happened in that space, that our culture was impacted. This is what happened, but Nikki is a part of our culture, and here's what we're going to do going forward. The most powerful way to do it would be the teacher to do it, so that the power remains with the teacher. This is why we actually practice that. In PD, I come into your classroom and I throw a chair down. I just threw a chair down in your classroom, respond to me. We practice those, because what happens is if you're not ready for it, it takes the power. The teacher is just undone. Can't imagine that student ever coming back into my classroom ever. You're a teacher. Like, a kid is going to be disrespectful to you. That hurts me when kids were disrespectful to me, because it's something I would never have done, because old school. But I learned how to deal with that. So we would restore the student, we would reclaim the class, we would also set the student up for success. We would put some things in place to set that student up for success. If the behavior is over and over and over and over again, yeah, we may suspend. But then we're going to figure out, do you need a behavior intervention plan? What do we need to do? Because inherently, 90% of the kids is just coming in to learn. So that's what we would do. We have that happen all the time. Come on, y'all. We have sub-separate classrooms. We got kids who pull down everything from the walls. That means you need something else. And we need to figure that out. So that's what we would do. To the class, you welcome them back. We talk with the student, we figure out what happened. Tell me why you did it. Here's what you did. And we try to be as proximate as possible to when it happened, depending on the age of the student. Because if you do it 2 days later with kindergarten, they're like, what? What are you talking about? So we have a conversation with the student, and we say something like, when you did this, this is what happened in our classroom. This was the impact. What were you feeling in that moment? We use the language, you had big feelings. You know that's a new language for me. You know I ain't say that growing up. But I've learned that. You showed some big feelings. Do you know why? Sometimes they don't know why. We figure out, did they eat this morning? Okay? Sometimes restoring a kid, we've done this. What is it? I'm hungry! Get this baby some food now. So we have a conversation with the student. We ensure they can at least articulate to some extent how their actions impacted the classroom. And then we ask them, are you ready to go back and learn? Are you able to sit in your seat or at your table? Here's what this looks like. It means you're gonna go back into the room. Again, I'm using elementary kind of language now. Go back into the room. We're going to be working on math, so you let them know what they're going back into, so they're not shocked. And you're successful when you can work for those first 10 minutes, and I'm gonna come by and do something to make you feel success. So you slowly give them opportunities to do the right thing. That is how I would restore them. And our kids, if they saw them come back in, they would just be like, whatever. Because usually it's the student who's always, who does that. You know, it's not a first time. We train our students, you just get to work. This person is a part of our community. Come in and work when the time is right. Now let's address what happened. But we already addressed it when the student left. Yes, sir. Thank you. I was going to say, you know, there are lots of options and expertise in the room. Oh, he said sometimes they suspend the parent. They make the parent come into the building. We've had parents say, can I come in? And we're like, absolutely, yes. Some parents who want to come in, we might say, woohoo, pause, you know, wait a minute, you know. But that, again, that's very creative, right? And what works for your culture works. The goal is suspension is the last straw. It's not the first thought. It's the last thought, if at all possible. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. As your ED, I would say, what do we need to do? Do we need to assess this student to see if they need more? We have sub-separate classrooms for students who have significant mental health challenges in elementary and middle school. And we have sub-separate classrooms for students who are cognitively delayed. So, and what we do with those systems is we try to still have the student be as much as possible with everyone else and leverage that space and the expertise that people have for students with those challenges, because that'll wear a teacher out. I don't want the principal bitten. No, that's not why I showed up to work, to get bitten. So I'm with you there. So I would try to figure out, I think this student needs more, and to see what we can give them. I will name some resources that we have. At my school of 588 students, I do have 4 mental health counselors, and that is what they do. They do clinical service. That's a decision I made as the executive director. In my staffing model, I'm paying for licensed clinical social workers in my classroom. And that is what they, in my schools, they don't do scheduling, no. They do therapy, honey. They are in those classrooms, and the director of that group is a part of the leadership team and meets with the principal. So those systems also help us to get things in place to support kids like that. But I would think that student needs something else. I'm going to.
You want to take one more question?
Yes. Yep. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And if I'm transitioning to a student to a more appropriate setting, that means that student has an IEP. I'm thinking that's what you're talking about. So here's what we tell families. We tell families, here's what we have the capacity to do with a student who has significant behavioral challenges. We have this, we have a room, we have a program. But there are schools that's what they do all day. And we have worked with our lawyers and with the other school districts to sometimes get kids placed in a different setting. We have done that because what we're doing is not working for that student. But I think that has maybe happened with 2 or 3 students. That's not 15 or 20 students, because that's a flag if you're always outplacing, that number of students. But what gives us the power to do that too is all the other stuff we did at first, before we said, we don't have what you need here. Yes. Yeah, what were you going to say about that, though?
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, in my experience, the tension is sometimes there's 2 things that happen. Sometimes in the example that you gave, the parent won't sign a consent to evaluate, right? And then what do you do? So that's one issue. But in a lot of cases, I think with a program that's a great program, the parents love it, like KIPP, they don't necessarily, KIPP does a lot to try to keep kids in school, and sometimes the parent really likes the school and doesn't want to make the change. I think the conversation, as Nikki's described, is, are you at a situation where the student's getting removed from class so much that it's not the least restrictive environment anymore? And so trying to have that conversation with parents, because I do think it is hard. Sometimes you just get, parents are like ready to pull the kid out and find a better place, but it can be a challenging discussion when they really like the program, but it's just not the right program. And so, each case is unique, but in Massachusetts, the way it would work is, if the IEP team determines that a child needs an out-of-district placement, usually the conversations with the local school district, do they have a program that can serve the student? If they can, then the student might go there. Or if it's a child with significant needs that needs a separate day program, public day program, or a residential program, then there's a conversation with the local school district about that, and if everyone's in agreement, then the student would go to the placement, and the local district would pay. But it can be a difficult conversation because a lot of times the parents are really happy with the program, so it just might not be the right fit.
I know you might close this out, but in 1 minute, here's what I'll say. If you're trying to think about this, like, you're not going to change your schools, your districts overnight. The first thing you have to do is something I wasn't doing. I wasn't looking at the data. I was not looking at, I want to know how many kids are suspended, what's the trend, who's being suspended the most, and we know this, which teacher is sending out kids for low-level things? For he was just loud, or she did this. Because a lot of times something happens at 9 a.m., by 12 noon, now the child has escalated, and we don't know. All we know is what happened at 12 noon or 2. So look at the data, and then find a data point and say, can we reduce the number of kids suspensions for this group of kids? Just make that your goal for 1 year. to see if you can reduce those suspensions in agreement with the teachers, because you don't want teachers to feel like they have to be in a classroom with kids who are offensive and challenging their humanity. We can't do that. Teaching is too hard. But we can together figure out how can we create the conditions for the student to thrive here and impact some of these numbers. It will take time. And some of our numbers are still too high, if you ask me. Go ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I just want to make our pitch to please do your evaluation in the app. They really appreciate that, and it's super helpful to us, those of us who present, to get that feedback. So thank you very much.
Thank